But here's where we start things off. We are following breaking news overseas, where Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov have just met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in India. Now, Blinken has urged Moscow, of course, to withdraw from what he calls its, quote, unjustified war with Ukraine. The summit comes with more reports of civilian casualties in Ukraine. Officials say a Russian missile hit a 5-story residential building in the southern city of Zaporizhzhia this morning. So CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab is following the very latest developments from Kyiv. So let us start first off, Imtiaz, with the G20 summit, because the last I heard, the Secretary of State said there are no plans to meet on the sidelines with Lavrov or his Chinese counterpart. Clearly, something changed.
Indeed. In fact, a lot of surprised faces in New Delhi as we saw essentially the most high-level face-to-face talks between the U.S. and Russia in many, many, many months. As you said, we had Secretary Blinken meeting with Sergey Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in New Delhi at the G20 summit. We understand that the two men met for around 10 minutes. And we also have some details of what they discussed in that 10-minute conversation. And there are 3 key points that we're hearing that these two men discussed. And I'll read them out to you. Essentially that, as you rightly pointed out in your introduction, that the U.S. would support Ukraine in the conflict for, quote, as long as it takes to bring the war to an end, that Russia should reverse its decision to suspend participation in the New START nuclear treaty, and that Moscow should release detained American Paul Whelan. So within that 10-minute conversation, they certainly covered an awful lot of ground. Now, the hosts India there in New Delhi certainly want this G20 summit to be about many other issues, but Ukraine really casting a long shadow over it. And China, of course, is part of that as well. The big question is, will China provide Russia with what they're asking for, which is lethal support? What does lethal support mean? It means Vladimir Putin wants China to start providing them with drones and ammunition, 2 things in very short supply with this war that Vladimir Putin launched on Ukraine now in its 2nd year. Anne-Marie.
And so, Imtiaz, let's talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground there in Ukraine. Russian forces are continuing their offensive. They want to capture the eastern mining town of Bakhmut. Can you give us a sense of how things are going? And once again, Bakhmut is not a large city. Why is this such an important city for Russia to capture?
I mean, it really, in a lot of ways, is a million-dollar question, and depending on who you ask, they have a different answer. Some argue that this is an extraordinarily strategic town for Russia. It will allow them to connect to other industrial areas in the Donetsk region, an area that Russia says that they have annexed. But you have others who say, hang on a second, Donetsk is a relatively small town. Sure, it has access to some areas of the greater Donetsk region, but in terms of real strategy, in terms of changing the thrust of this war, it's really not going to achieve that. And yet we've seen this terrible situation on the ground there in in Bakhmut, a city which was home once to 70,000 people. We understand only a few thousand are remaining. It was a salt and gypsum mining town. And again, it was a sort of blink if you miss it kind of place. And yet for the past 7 months, Russia has just been grinding it into dust. And we, of course, have the Wagner mercenaries on the ground. And although Ukraine has been putting up a pretty stiff opposition for a very long time, that appears to be changing. In fact, senior figures within the Zelensky government saying that the situation not looking very good. Mr. Zelensky saying the same thing. There are Ukrainian forces on the ground. However, we do understand that some units have started withdrawing. So the situation not very good, and some concern that Bakhmut could fall to Russia, which at least symbolically would be very important for Russia, but strategically still an open question. Anne-Marie.
I'm really glad you highlighted that. I mean, symbolically, yes, you could call it a win, but at such great loss, is it even a win worth counting? Imtiaz, thank you very much.